Global trade disrupted, prices skyrocketing, conflicts raging. This is what happens if the US loses its place as the world's most dominant power, and it could happen sooner than you expect. On today's episode of The Infographic Show, we're looking at the fallout if America loses its position as a superpower. First, what exactly is a superpower? The term gets thrown around a lot by the media, and it's almost never used correctly. Today, various media outlets often refer to the US, Russia, and China as superpowers. But this is wrong. The world only has two superpowers, and it's the United States of America and Beyoncé. Geopolitically, though, since the end of the Cold War and arguably through much of the second half, there has only ever been one superpower, the United States. So what exactly makes America an OP character? The answer lies in various different facets of the modern US. First, a superpower must have global military reach. That is the simplest and most common definition used to describe such states, though it is one the media often stumbles on. US forces are everywhere, and if they're not, they're close by. Just one short C-130 or helicopter ride away from being in your backyard. That is no accident, and it is not for the reason you think. The US military serves two primary goals. First, to keep conflict far from American shores. Second, to maintain global stability. When nations aren't fighting, economies thrive. That stability is good for the world and for the United States. With the ability to deploy several thousand troops and hundreds of combat aircraft anywhere in the world within 48 hours, few nations have the resources or the nerve to test the global peace largely enforced by US military hegemony. When the US turns isolationist, the global order deteriorates, and when that happens, the US economy suffers, hurting America most of all. Russia or China don't have the capacity to deploy large amounts of military power far from their shores. China is working on this, but to this day their navy remains largely a coastal force that can't operate far from their own shores and needs friendly air support. Unlike China, the US Navy brings its own air force to the sea, and it is big enough to rank among the world's largest. And Russia, well, superpowers don't spend 3 years struggling to take a tenth of their neighbor's territory. But military power is only a part of the question, because a superpower also has to have global financial reach. In this regard, China can actually challenge the US, sort of. While Chinese economic influence has exploded in the last 2 decades, most of global trade is still done with the dollar. Only a tiny percentage is done in Chinese yuan. When the US imposes sanctions on a nation, they don't come on their own. They trigger a global pile-on. That's the other side of being a superpower, a worldwide network of allies you directly influence. When the US moves, it almost never moves alone. That's the staggering diplomatic weight of a superpower, the ability to shape global events through soft power alone. China can only do this regionally, and even then, only sometimes. There's one other aspect of being a superpower that people rarely ever consider: culture. US culture is global, and while it doesn't have the hegemony it once did during the Cold War, it is still a force to be reckoned with. Odds are, when you go to the movies, the summer blockbusters you're watching are American movies with American actors. This isn't an accident. During the Cold War, one of the US's greatest tools against communism was Hollywood. American ideals and values were without a doubt better spread around the world by Hollywood movies than through missiles. No nation today has the sheer cultural might that the US does, whose TV shows, movies, video games, comic books, fashion, and music are truly global phenomenons. Taking all aspects of a superpower into consideration, there is only one reigning superpower, and it is not even close: the United States. China may be rising militarily, but its films still struggle to find reliable overseas audiences. Aside from TikTok and possibly Huawei, most of the world would struggle to identify Chinese influence in their daily lives. And yet, America's status as a superpower is being challenged like never before. And in many ways, it is willingly giving up that status through very bad domestic decisions. So what would happen if America lost its superpower status, and what could make that happen? Well, to do that, we need to understand how the US could lose its place at the top, because in history, every power eventually falls. First, there's economic concerns that could trigger the downfall of the US. Chief amongst these, at the moment, are its ever-rising foreign debt and the results of a potential war with China. US debt payments keep climbing each year, forcing Washington to spend more and more on interest. This isn't always bad. Nations can run deficits for decades as long as interest doesn't grow faster than the economy itself. There's many, however, that fear that the US has either crossed or will soon cross the point where the debt outpaces domestic economic growth. and loss of confidence in America's ability to pay its IOUs would shake confidence in the dollar and the entire global economic order. The economic result of a war with China could be even more devastating than the military one. In any future and increasingly very likely scenario where the US and China go to war, military losses are predicted to be steep for the US even in victory. But the staggering cost of rebuilding a very expensive military could cripple the US, especially if the war results in significant harm to US infrastructure, either digitally or physically. Submarine-launched long-range missiles could target critical infrastructure on the US mainland from a significant distance. If history is anything to go by, the US Navy's spotty record against subs could spell trouble. Chinese submarines might slip past American pickets in the Pacific and get close enough to strike. A massive cyber attack, though, could also wreak havoc on US infrastructure, potentially with physically destructive results as dams and electric substations are hijacked. The American economy could be brought to its knees as a result of cyber sabotage, a deadly threat to the nation's increasingly information technology-dominated economy. The end result of a multi-year war could see the US drained militarily and financially, a husk of its former self, and on the outs as a global superpower. The military cost of a major war could by itself be enough to trigger this collapse. A superpower can't just be one of the things we described above. It has to be all of them at the same time. If the US militarily suffers significant losses of personnel and very expensive equipment, its ability to project power globally would erode, and this would open the door to nightmare scenarios that we'll be getting into very shortly. America's superpower status could collapse if it falls behind in the new tech race. AI and energy breakthroughs will define the 21st century. AI will shape everything from warfare to daily life. Falling behind in the AI race would be like missing the jet engine or the computer revolution in the 20th century. It wouldn't trigger national collapse, but it would lock the losers so far behind that catching up would be nearly impossible. Say goodbye to Microsoft and Apple's chokehold on the global computer market and say hello to AI superpowered foreign devices. The United States could lose its superpower status in a very unexpected way, and one that is happening right now. Ever since the end of the Second World War, the United States has been a beacon for the world's most talented scientists, engineers, artists, and more. The US offered stability and opportunity found nowhere else. Its rise as a superpower was fueled by waves of scientists, engineers, and artists fleeing war-torn Europe. Since then, America has been seen as the land of opportunity, with universities and companies eager to welcome highly qualified immigrants. Yet today, more and more STEM and artist immigrants are choosing greener pastures elsewhere. STEM students in particular are either being poached or scared away from coming to the US. Difficulties with long-term visas like the H-1B frustrate or outright prevent immigration from qualified professionals. Meanwhile, students are being actively poached by countries like Canada and even China. Further complicating matters are difficulties in obtaining long-term visas after graduation, and no clear pathway to a green card. The addition of more in-person interviews and other restrictive measures only compound those problems and further deter prospective immigrants. Instead, they are increasingly choosing Europe, Canada, Australia, and in some cases even China, who is actively attempting to lure in more and more STEM professionals. This is a big problem for the United States because every year China issues more PhDs than the US has natively working inside of the country. As America evolves to become an information technology powerhouse, its economy is in jeopardy of petering out due to a shortage of STEM professionals. Likewise, as a cultural superpower, as the US becomes less attractive to artists and entrepreneurs, the more they'll turn to alternative nations. And there's also serious money on the line, billions of dollars. EB-5 visas, or the Immigrant Investor Program, allows for foreign nationals to obtain permanent lawful residence by investing at least $800,000 into specific parts of the U.S. economy. Other areas require an investment of $1.05 million and must create at least 10 full-time jobs. And in the last 10 years, this program has brought in $20 billion in investment into the American economy. Now it doesn't stop there. Immigrants are statistically twice as likely as Americans to launch new companies, and over half of the U.S.'s $1 billion startups were founded by immigrants. With $652 billion paid in taxes in 2023, immigrants are a vital part of not just the day-to-day American economy, but its future. But today, failed policies and an economy that leaves most people behind are driving that money elsewhere. So what happens if the U.S. folds on its superpower status? In a word, pandemonium. First, the United States dollar would tank as a global reserve currency, creating economic chaos and increasing the cost of global trade. As of 2022, 54% of global trade is done in dollars, meaning over half of all trade would suddenly need to be done in alternative currencies. The chaos in the banking system would only compound the difficulty of transition, and various currencies would suddenly start competing for dominance, as would the nations backing them. Without the US dollar reigning supreme, intense international competition could devolve into all-out trade wars, and possibly even real ones. This would significantly hurt the US as well, given the large benefits it reaps by conducting trade in its own currency. The cost of everyday goods would see a sharp increase in America, putting serious financial strain on a middle class that's already under serious pressure. Domestic turmoil would make current political tensions even worse, leading to outbreaks of violence. America could very well face a civil war as it breaks under the burden of all of its troubles. On the global landscape, the loss of the dollar as a global reserve currency would also have serious repercussions for American diplomacy. Its influence over finance institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank would wane. This would limit its ability to leverage these institutions to both benefit itself and punish nations that upset the liberal world order. Nations like Russia would be much harder to punish for bad actions, like invading their neighbor, and America's fall from grace would be terrible news geopolitically. Welcome back to the Westphalian age of nation-state warfare. Today, the U.S. military deters large-scale war around the world, a deterrence that has preserved peace for decades. It failed in Ukraine only because Kyiv lay outside of America's security umbrella, and Russia believed it could take the capital in 3 days. What Moscow never expected was a multi-year war and the staggering price it would pay. But other Russian ambitions have been successfully kept in check by the might of the U.S. military and economy both. The Baltic states quite literally owe their continued independence to America's military prowess, falling under the U.S.'s umbrella of protection as treaty allies. Their safety has never been in question, at least until now. Likewise, America's nuclear umbrella spreads to nations around the world, with guarantees that any nuclear attack against them would be treated as an attack against the U.S. But with the collapse of the U.S. as a superpower, both of those assurances break down with dire consequences. First, Europe would see major wars again in regular intervals as it has during its entire history. The current peaceful 80 years that Europe has enjoyed has largely been thanks to America's status as a superpower and friend. Europe didn't suddenly get bored of war after nearly a millennia of constant conflict. America's influence provided a rallying point for nations, and its military deterred any bad faith actors from exploiting their neighbors' weaknesses. Trade with the U.S. also helped convince Europeans that making money was preferable to war. Without U.S. security guarantees, Europe would splinter. States on Russia's border could be pulled back into Moscow's orbit. Rival blocs would form across Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, each seeking security through alliances, but only fueling competition. And as history shows, when no dominant power keeps the peace, war inevitably follows. But the loss of American military superpower status would also affect the world in an unexpected way, and we are seeing it play out in the Red Sea today. When the Houthis began attacking global shipping passing by the shores of Yemen, it had consequences around the world. As of 2023, 6.2 million barrels of oil pass by their shores every day, and a significant portion of the goods you enjoy. The attacks on shipping have had effects on almost every nation on Earth. China has seen costs of shipping goods from Shanghai to Genoa increase by a staggering 350%. Routes between Asia and Europe have increased in cost by 200 to 400% overall. Insurance premiums have skyrocketed as much as 1,000% for some vessels, and rerouting to avoid Houthi attacks or insurance hikes adds $1 million in fuel for large vessels and a delay of up to 2 weeks. This has an impact on follow-on costs for economies that rely on the timely shipment of goods. Many companies have had to stop work altogether as they wait for inventory, causing a loss of wages to workers around the world. The attacks are a disaster that the U.S. Navy was specifically built to prevent. America's global military presence is often mocked, with critics calling it the world's cop. But the war in Ukraine and the Houthi attacks on global shipping show why that presence exists and why the world needs it. Neither Europe nor China could muster the force to stop the disruption, even though they suffered the most from it. The U.S. did respond to the Houthi attacks, though unfortunately not in the way that the world expected of it. After an intense bombing campaign, President Trump announced that a ceasefire had been reached with the Houthis, one that has held to this day. Unfortunately, the deal struck with the Houthis was entirely self-serving. The Houthis agreed to stop the attacks on U.S.-flagged vessels in exchange for the U.S. ceasing its bombing campaign against them. While attacks against U.S. vessels have stopped, 2 Liberian-flagged and Greek-owned ships were attacked and sunk in the 2 months after. Now, the Houthis have announced an expansion of their campaign to any vessel, no matter its flag, that has any business with Israel. Initially, the U.S. was expected to do what it has historically done: raise an international coalition and lead it to end the Houthi threat. Instead, after a brief bombing campaign, the U.S. acted in its own interests alone and then promptly abandoned the Red Sea. If America can only be relied on to act upon its own self-interests, then it's not a reliable partner to anybody. But the situation in the Red Sea is informative of what the world can expect without a superpower to keep the peace. These types of extortion or outright piracy campaigns were common throughout maritime history, with trade lanes often only secured at great expense and by great naval powers, and even then only within a limited geographic scope. What the U.S. had accomplished after the Second World War was a global maritime free trade corridor, with security guarantees built on the back of the U.S. Navy. This brought global prices down and directly led to the expansion of national economies as trade became easier and more lucrative. But if the United States were to lose superpower status, the world would see a return to the chaos of the past, only worse. Currently, there is simply no power in the world that can affect global military influence like the U.S. Without it, Europe and China, for instance, would be extremely hard-pressed to protect their trade corridors against regional bad actors or just chaos as individual nations fight each other. Again, no European or Chinese task force could be mustered, or has yet been mustered, to ensure the security of their own maritime traffic against the Houthi attacks. So now, imagine the loss of the U.S. military hegemony and the ensuing chaos as the age of free global maritime trade comes to an end. What is good for America has often been good for the world, and that's not by accident. While acting in its own interest, the U.S. has long seen the value of global prosperity. The more prosperous a world, the more stable it becomes, and that stability means fewer wars for America to police and a stronger U.S. economy in return. In the shadow of a giant, the rest of the world benefits too. That's why America's turn inward, putting self-interest above long-standing international norms, is a concern for everyone. Well, everyone except China and Russia. They would like nothing more than for the U.S. to step back, leaving them free to shape the global order to their liking. And if America ever lost its superpower status, the consequences could get personal fast. Find out what happens to you if the U.S. restarts the draft, or click on this video instead.